Welcome. There's a very standard and very familiar way of framing the Great War, a war now better known as World War I. And it goes like this. When Franz Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria and heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire, was assassinated on June 28, 1914, the nations of Europe rapidly polarized and soon plunged headlong into a protracted and profoundly destructive war that cost nearly 20 million lives with even more injured. Major hostilities only ended after 4 years, with the signing of the armistice between the Allies and Germany in 1918. Today, we'll introduce the Great War and test this narrative. It's not wrong to say that the First World War began because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated by a member of the terrorist organization, the Black Hand. But this only explains part of the story. There's a much larger international and imperial background. Archduke Ferdinand was heir to the Austrian throne. His assassination fundamentally altered a very precarious balance of conflicting international interests. At the time, there was war in the Balkans. To the east, this war was tied up with Russian imperial power. Austria had annexed the Balkans in 1908, which placed it at odds with Russia. But to the west of the Balkans was Germany. Reunified in 1871, it sought to expand its territory at the expense of Italy. Meanwhile, the Italians wanted to be rid of the Austrian presence to their east in the Balkans. And Great Britain, with its global empire then at the height of its power and influence, not only sought to expand its hold throughout the southern hemisphere, for example, in Africa, India, Singapore, etc., but this also set it against those European powers that stood in its way. And yet, war did not begin immediately. Approximately 6 weeks passed between the assassination and August 4th, 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany. During this time, many, but not all, of Europe's powers began to take sides. The United States, it should be noted, was not yet involved. But we should be careful to not make any of this sound too ominous. No one had any idea that 1914 would be the beginning of a 4-year slaughter unlike anything ever seen in human history. While the assassination of Prince Ferdinand goes some way toward explaining why the Great War began, it does not and cannot explain why the Great War lasted so long and proved so profoundly destructive. Many contemporaries were at first baffled and then angered by the war's duration. Here, too, there's no one simple answer. But we can't understand the matter without understanding the role of military technology. In late 1914, there was no sense that new forms of technology would soon redefine warfare. For example, cavalry, that is, soldiers on horseback, were used throughout the Great War. You might even say that the Great War was the last war of the 19th century and the first war of the 20th century. In fact, by 1915, new forms of technology were already rendering the old world obsolete. Among the weapons developed were tanks, military aircraft, and chemical warfare. Consider that the Wright brothers successfully flew their plane in 1903, and yet, if you look at pictures, that plane almost looks like a toy. In the space of less than 15 years, those rudimentary planes have become far more complex and far more deadly. Chemical warfare was another development. Mustard gas is perhaps best known today, but it only led to the development of different kinds of gas. Some of these would be used later in World War II, especially in concentration camps. And finally, there was the tank. Here we see in 1915 the artillery tractor, a precursor to the tank. It's a cannon on wheels, pushed by a tractor. But just 1 year later, we have not a precursor but the tank itself. Perhaps more than any of the other technological developments, the tank was seen as a genuine terror. Contemporary literary descriptions referred to it as both a monster and a demon. In order to hopefully gain a winning advantage, prolonged military conflict spurred rapid technological development. But of course, this was true of all sides. So, rapid technological development also spurred prolonged military conflict. Each fed into the other. One effect of new military technology was the total destruction of vast tracts of land throughout Europe. In his best-selling memoir of the Great War, Storm of Steel, Ernst Junger, a German soldier, described it this way. In this neighborhood of villages, meadows, woods, and fields, there was literally not a bush or a tiniest blade of grass to be seen. There, where lately there had been the idyllic picture of rural peace, there was as faithful a picture of the soul of scientific war. In earlier wars, certainly, towns and villages had been burned. But what was that compared with the sea of craters dug out by machines? Because wars involve both allies and opponents, it is perhaps tempting to also assume that start dates and end dates are no less clear. In some ways, the Great War follows this pattern. The Allies included Britain, France, and Russia. They were later joined by Italy and the United States, but Russia dropped out following the Russian Revolution in 1917. On the other hand, were the Central Powers, that is, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. No less clear is the fact that much of the war was fought along a well-defined pair of geographical boundaries. One is the Western Front, that is, the western side of Germany, where conquest occurred and fighting took place. The other is the Eastern Front, that is, the eastern side of Germany, where again conquest occurred and fighting took place. The Allies on the Western Front included France and Britain early on. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Allies were largely restricted to Russia and Romania. But, in other ways, the Great War lacks lines of clear demarcation. This is especially true when we talk about dates. The standard dating begins in 1914 and ends in 1918, with the Treaty of Versailles signed in 1919. In fact, we need to back way up here. The Great War overlapped with multiple revolutions in Europe. For example, the Irish Revolution began in April 1916 against the United Kingdom. The Russian Revolution then began in February 1917, intensifying that October following a successful communist coup. Both the Irish and Russian revolutions eventually saw a civil war. Ireland's civil war ended in 1921 and Russia's in 1922. The Great War was also a factor in both revolutions. So we might ask, did the Great War end in Ireland or Russia with the armistice? Things are still more complicated when we look at Germany. And in fact, in 1918, Germany saw its own revolution, one that concluded the following year and saw the birth of Germany's parliamentary democracy, better known as the Weimar Republic, an ill-fated polity that proved unstable and short-lived. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles laid the guilt for the war at the feet of the Germans. This article was subsequently known as the War Guilt Clause. It charged Germany with reparations totaling in today's currency more than $400 billion. They also had to make territorial concessions. It left Germans feeling victimized, and that sense of resentment festered throughout the 1920s. Many might see here the beginnings of extremist authoritarian politics, and that isn't unfair. But there's also a bigger issue here. The Great War saw the collapse of three European empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also known as the Habsburg Empire, and the Russian Empire. And it also saw the collapse of a fourth empire, the Ottoman Empire. After 1918, much of the land that had once encompassed the German, Habsburg, and Russian empires was now without stable government. Today, historians describe these as Shatter-Zones. Sometimes fighting continued there into the 1920s. In many instances, extremist politics took root there too, because governments had collapsed, leaving a political vacuum. And this had a very long influence. So what? By 1915, the British, French, and Italians were already calling the conflict the Great War, but the Germans used a different term, the World War. In 1921, a variant of this terminology developed in Britain, the more commonly known English phrase, First World War. At a technical level, this wasn't really accurate. Both the 18th and the 19th centuries had witnessed massive international European conflicts, such as the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. So why use the term First World War? An implication seems to have been that more world wars were expected to follow. And since this war was the first fully industrialized war, it was, for many, a fundamentally new kind of war. And in many ways, it presaged later 20th century developments. But this also means that there are really two frames of reference for understanding the events that began in 1914. One is more strictly contextual. It would approach the Great War as just that, the Great War, which began in 1914 and saw the termination of most hostilities 4 years later. This is how contemporaries understood it. Only later did some speculate that the Great War would be only the First World War. Consequently, this is our second frame of reference, one that begins in 1914 but then extends through 1945. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. There's no shortage of general introductions to the Great War. For a quick study, read The First World War, a very short introduction by Michael Howard. It offers a clear narrative, largely organized on a year-by-year basis. And, as with all books in Oxford's very short introduction series, it's a great way to begin. More detailed is the Oxford Illustrated History of the First World War, edited by Hugh Strachan. Its 24 chapters cover everything from the start of the war, diverse facets of the home front, and the question of whether the Great War really ended in 1918. And of course, its many illustrations are worth many thousands of words. For a broad introduction to the German side of things, read Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918, by Katja Hoyer. It's an excellent read. Only its sweeping last chapter studies the Great War, but thereby places it in the context of the rise and fall of the Second Reich. Finally, for an excellent overview of the Western Front, read Wounded, A New History of the Western Front in World War I, by Emily Mayhew. She focuses not on tactics, but on the experience of those who worked at the Western Front. Soldiers, but especially medical personnel. It's a harrowing study, and it perfectly encapsulates the view that war really is hell. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.